Hello, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Story time again. Are you ready for another story time? My head's gonna be cut off by this screen unless I slouch a little today. Huh? I'll work. Should I fix that? My camera is a little jiggy. We'll see. We'll get through this with my head cut off a little bit. That's fine. Today in story time, I'm reading again. This is my third day in reading and doing story time. Nowhere Except San Francisco by Memoirs of a Resident Tourist by Tro Harper. We're on to the first real chapter of the book, Cable Car Capers, the SF Cable Railway thus far. Hey, Ulysses! How's it going? All right, is everybody ready for some cable car capers? Cable car capers. Oh my. Rush her at the crossings, catch her on the rise, easy round the corners when the dust is in your eyes. Gelett Burgess. Of all the tourist attractions in San Francisco, the only one that can compete with the cable car is the Golden Gate Bridge. But then the cable cars have an immediacy, a clanging, rattling, noisy presence. If you don't see the first one, another appears in a few minutes. As one after another jounce through the streets, people stand on the sidewalk, fascinated, gawkers to the core. If the people are accompanied by children, the yells that go up are shrill and fractious and implore immediate boarding. It was ever thus, and little wonder. For some 35 years, cable cars trundled by the front door of my bookshop on Powell Street, and I got so used to seeing and hearing the slap-slap of the cables in the slot, plus the rhythmic beat of the warning bells, cable cars became as much a part of the street scene as the potted trees and the wandering musicians. Every time a car stopped at the corner of Powell and O'Farrell to let passengers board, there was ever a scramble, with the seats going to the quickest if not the politest. And, well, they might scamper and scuttle for seats, as riders know almost by osmosis, the visual treats that lie just over the next rise as the cars trundle up the Powell Street hill and then plunge down the other side, rattling and clanging as they go. Stella has come to say hello. Kitty! My cat is here. Among other benefits, a rider can relax on a cable car and fill exhaust-choked nostrils with salt air, plus a whiff or two of bilgy bay water as it laps at the pilings, hemming the waterfront. These are the rewards for native and tourist alike. Every cable car rider who stands on the running board and grips the handlebar tightly for the drop down the Hyde Street hill on the way to Fisherman's Wharf finds a thrill unlike any other. As the car slides toward the waterfront, riders exhale both sighs of relief and exultation. Millions of tourists have visited San Francisco over the century and a half since Rudyard Kipling, the British poet, storyteller, and winner of a Nobel Prize for Literature, described the San Francisco of 1889 as a mad city inhabited for the most part by perfectly insane people whose women are of a remarkable beauty. A city of people living in a hopeless maze of small wooden houses, dust, street refuse, and children who play with empty kerosene cans. He rode the cables, one by one, over the ragged sand hills pegged down by houses. Recklessness is in the air. The roaring winds of the Pacific make you drunk to begin with. The aggressive luxury on all sides helps out the intoxication. They make greatly and they spend lavishly. He found only one drawback. 'Tis hard to leave. Daily life in San Francisco is, well, daily. But where else in the world can you get where else in the world can you board a prosaic streetcar that not only gets people where they want to go, but delivers them to their destinations feeling better than when they got on board? In an age when people talk with one another through keyboards hooked to a jumble of electronic pixels and pictures called the internet, take transatlantic flights of less than 3 hours wedged into a machine closely resembling an aluminum test tube, there is a satisfying reassurance on boarding a cable car that the world has not yet reached a point of no return. For over 100 years now, cable cars have spread the fame of the city throughout the world. In 1869, pilgrims streamed into California as the Civil War ended, and the Transcontinental Railroad became a reality. From a tangled collection of shacks, the population grew, by the end of the century, to almost 400,000. From day one, these citizens didn't much like the idea of walking to work, especially if it entailed climbing hills that rose as much as 1 foot in every 8. Into this new world, a young fellow named Andrew Smith and his father sailed with high hopes, unbounded optimism, plus a willingness to face whatever the future held. The senior Smith was an inventor and had early on devised a metal cable consisting of steel strands wrapped around a hemp rope. It was an invention that not only made cables more flexible, but gave them more tensile strength than anything manufactured before. Sometime in the early 1800s, the cables had proved themselves in use in Europe. Once in the teeming San Francisco of that day and time, father and son looked around for something to do. But while the father didn't say much, he was so appalled by the sights and sounds of the teeming metropolis, he took one look at the poverty-stricken city and boarded a ship for home. Andrew, however, younger and more venturesome, resolved to try his luck in the mines along the upper reaches of the Sacramento River. After a few days of prospecting, he managed to scratch up an ounce or two of gold. But as he watched exhausted miners hauling tailings in baskets on their shoulders down a hill, across a stream, and up another rise, he sold the mill owner on the idea of buying some wire rope. Andrew pointed out that with a small stationary steam engine and for power, the ore could be loaded in baskets suspended from a wire rope and swung over the uneven ground much faster than men could carry the horrendous loads of rocks on their shoulders. The mill owner ordered 200 feet of cable. Inside a week, after installation, production doubled. By the end of the month, every small mining operation had an Andrew Smith hauling system, and the proprietor of this novel enterprise was making more money than the gold bugs. Smith began thinking in grander terms than those of a service provider for catch-as-catch-can mine operators. San Francisco and future expansion into riches and fame lured him on to Sacramento, that's a big city, where he met and married Martha Elizabeth Woods, daughter of a local cabinet maker. In short time, they moved to the Bay Area and opened a wire rope manufactory on the San Francisco waterfront. As his dreams devolved into more everyday dimensions, Smith remembered a famous relation, Andrew S. Halliday, who had served with honor at the Battle of Waterloo and was knighted by King George IV. He was well known as a member of Parliament. Andrew Smith, the wire rope manufacturer, decided he would profit from a change of name. So lining up at the local records office, he sought and was granted the name of Andrew Smith Holliday for himself. And at that time, clerks in such offices were not exactly good at spelling and entered names in the record books as they heard them, which led to his new name being spelled with a final I-E instead of the proper A-Y. While Andrew Smith Halliday gets the credit for inventing the cable car, records in the San Francisco Public Library tell a different tale. Bronze plaques bolted to the wall in Halliday Plaza, at the foot of Powell Street adjoining Market, and in Halliday Building downtown, state categorically he is the creator of the cable railway. Contradicting this ukase, the city directory for 1880, under a heading Progress of the City, relates the story of the beginnings of the cable car in great detail. The record outlines plans for a Clay Street cable railroad, distinguished as being the pioneer cable road not only of this city, but of the world. the brainchild of Benjamin H. Brooks, son of a pioneer lawyer. According to his request for franchise, Brooks planned to install an endless cable traveling in a trench below the surface of the street and powered by a stationary steam engine. It would pull cars up hills and slow their descent on the downslope. The men he chose as partners, notably Abner Doubleday, felt it would be no problem to hitch cars to the cable. Doubleday had a reputation as an inventor with several patents to his credit, as well as a distinguished Civil War record, and was living in San Francisco. He was the same Doubleday who gets the credit for devising the game of baseball. Together with Dodo H. Hepburn, described as a skillful engineer, Brooks enlisted the help of C.S. Bushnell and E.W. Steele. These four men formed the Clay Street Cable Railway, the better to transport passengers from downtown out to Cow Hollow, an area known today as Union Street, now one of the city's more fashionable shopping districts. They petitioned the city's fathers for franchise that would grant them the right to construct their line, work to begin within 1 year, completion due in 3, and a contract that would last for 25 years from August 1st, 1870. August 1st, that's my birthday! Aha! The franchise also stated that the speed limit would be 8 miles an hour, and the license fee would not exceed $50 a year per car in use. Local moneybags, however, felt such a scheme was foolhardy. Although residents worn out by the daily hill climbs to their jobs, plus merchants along the route, dearly wanted the system, but their fundraising efforts produced only $30,000. With such meager capital, the entrepreneurs finally conceded the only thing they could do was retreat with honor, and for a very nominal consideration, transfer the franchise to Andrew Holliday, along with the right to use the original name. When the disturbing news of this long-covered-up bit of cable car lore hit the papers, those who thought they knew everything about such matters stuffed the letters columns of the local press with venom and zeal. Halliday was, too, the inventor of the cable car, and please don't confuse us with such facts. But it only stands to reason that while Brooks and his group may have gotten the original franchise, they would have had to turn to Halliday and his friends for the cable and some device or other that could grab the moving wire rope in its trench beneath the street without tearing it apart. It is perhaps fair to say neither group could have accomplished much if the other had not existed. It's an axiom that when a great idea arrives in the world, while it may come through at various places and to various people at the same time, there's always a fluctuation in the degree of clarity and definition. Some inventions appear full-blown. Others have to be twisted, tortured, and manipulated before they are born into usefulness. One of the great mysteries of discovery is how the same idea occurs to any number of thinkers at the same time, to be implemented individually. Although Halliday gets the credit, the legend of the initial inspiration for the cable car could have happened to either Brooks or Halliday. The story, today having achieved the status of legend, is that one rainy night, it's already good, as Halliday walked up a hill paved with cobblestones on his way home from work, he witnessed 4 horses pulling a streetcar. One of the animals slipped and fell to the cobbles. The other horses panicked, and without motive power, the conductor tried to apply the brakes to keep the car from sliding back down the hill, only to find the brakes were too weak to hold both the loaded car and the drag of the horses. The car began to slide back, towing the horses behind it. Shrieking passengers, shattering glass, and animals screaming in pain dissolved into chaos at the bottom. That night, Halliday began to piece together a plan for a claim. There's no, oops, am I here? Looked like there was a little resetting there. I just saw a little swirly. Can someone tell me in the comments if I'm still here? I'll keep reading. I'm going to take a sip of water for a second. Kind of fun, a little intrigue. Thanks, Ben. Yay, it's back. I don't know how much you missed Let's see. I just saw this. Our town had street horse. Had street cars, horse. Oh, the marked. Your town had horse-drawn streetcars. Yep, that was very common back in the day. Oh, dear. All right. So anyway, that night, Holiday began to piece together a plan for a car drawn by a cable, powered by a stationary steam engine. There's no reason to believe Brooks could not have experienced a like incident, as the frightening accident was not uncommon. By the time Holiday and his stockholders, a printer, a papermaker, and the local sheriff had purchased the franchise from Brooks and Company, however, Andrew had done a massive amount of theorizing about how he could make his cable railway do what it had to do. Most of the locals, both good friends plus the usual cynics, laughed at him, labeling the enterprise with the unoriginal sobriquet Halliday's Folly. Almost from day one, he had worked out in his mind how to keep the cable from pulling itself apart when a heavy weight was applied, how to pass it around the street corners on pulleys, and keep the moving rope in its slot as it towed a car up and down the hills on which the city is built. The paramount problem was how to grab a moving cable. A claw or hook, anything that could grab the hemp and steel cable, would have to extend beneath the car, through a slot, and down to the contact point beneath the street, where, like an open hand, it could hitch a ride on the moving rope. He visualized a device that, once pressure was applied, would fasten onto the cable ever more tightly, as the cable slid through the jaws of the grip and the tight till it was up to speed with the cable. The heavier the load, the tighter the grip had to be. The first grip was simplicity itself. A wheel welded to a long screw ran through the floor of the dummy car down to the cable. In the beginning, the dummy car was hitched to the front of the passenger car and was called a dummy because while it wasn't a locomotive or a horse pulling a buggy, it was out front. Since it was a fake locomotive, it was called a dummy. The envisioned grip could then tighten around the cable in the manner of some current-day fancy nutcrackers squeezing down on a pecan. Turn the screw handle far enough and the nut begins to crack. Turn the hand wheel far enough and the device begins to grip the cable. Nowadays, levers control the grip, but it is essentially the same physics problem it was in 1873. Also, when the grip man dropped the cable, the car's brakes went into action to slow the vehicle until it stopped. Old customs die hard, as witness the preference for automobiles with motors in front instead of in the rear, or the middle for that matter. Today, Powell Street cable cars are seemingly self-propelled, except when it gets to the end of the line and has to be trundled around a turntable. The California line, however, has a front and rear grip, and once the car gets to the end of the line, the gripman walks from back to front or front to back, depending on how you look at it, and takes off. During the spring and summer of 1873, construction crews tore up Clay Street, dug a trench for the moving cable, and anchored a steam engine to the floor in the powerhouse at Leavenworth and Clay. After putting down planks over the cobblestones, tracks were laid. The morning of August 1 was put up or shut up time, since if service didn't begin then, the franchise was forfeit. In the early morning hours of that fateful day, sometime around 4 o'clock a.m., workmen shoved a slight little box on wheels onto the tracks at Clay and Jones as the summer fog, driven by a stiff breeze all the way around from the Aleutian Islands, swooshed around the tiny gathering at the corner of Jones and Clay Street. Here the historical record is somewhat murky. Some say Halliday doubted the brakes would hold, and so the trial run down the hill was managed by lowering the car by means of ropes. Other reports state that Halliday and his partners got on the car and told the gripman to hitch his grip to the cable and take off down the hill. But the gripman failed in the clutch, locked the brakes, dismounted, and stumbled off into the darkness, muttering something about a wife and children. He was never seen again. I think that's the story I want to hear. At this juncture, Halliday himself grabbed the grip wheel, gave it a few turns until he felt the cable begin to pull them forward, and down the hill they went, much to the amusement of a French cafe owner who watched the descent from his bedroom window and shouted a rousing, "Vive la France!" He also tossed a wilted bunch of flowers from his second-story window. The tiny car trundled down the 20% grade to Kearny Street at 4 miles an hour. Once at the bottom, a small crew turned the car around on a turntable and the trip back up to Jones Street began. Later that day, a car full of ticketed riders climbed aboard and fulfilled the franchise contract. It's been full speed ahead ever since. Excuse me. Today, the only cable lines left in the world are the Powell Market route to Fisherman's Wharf, the Powell line to the end of Hyde Street, and the California line from the waterfront to Van Ness Avenue. These exist only because of the untiring efforts of the Committee to Save the Cable Cars, led by Mrs. Friedel Klusman in 1947. Back then, rumor had it the cables were to be discontinued and buses were to be used instead. Buses that could practically soar up the hills, according to their supporters, but the phalanxes of anti-change, and that includes almost all San Franciscans, led by Mrs. Klusman, set up such a caterwauling the city council retreated in disarray. Once Mrs. Klusman saw she had a good thing going, she didn't stop. She charged right on to Washington, clamoring for a measure to declare the cable cars a national treasure or a national park, a national anything that would keep the creaky antiques clanging and banging. She almost single-handedly took on the cost cutters at City Hall and won. Not only did she save the cable cars from the loud mouthings of bus enthusiasts, she was also able to persuade the National Park Service to declare the odd little railroad a national landmark, thereby ensuring its existence for time without end, or at least until a new administration decides to make a change. At the height of the foofara about abandoning the cable system, one commentator said, "If you're going to get rid of the cable cars, why not get rid of Fisherman's Wharf? It smells of salt from the sea, reeks of fish, and bilge water from under the piers. Besides, thousands of seagulls circling overhead may provide the unsuspecting visitor from Iowa with a load of last night's fish dinner. Also, there are crab pots bubbling over open fires. Isn't that a violation of something or other?" A new crisis, which turned out to be a non-crisis, loomed in 1982, when the Muni decided the time had come for a complete renovation of the system. The powers at City Hall decided to shut down cable travel at the end of the tourist season in September. Equipment, streets, pipes, sewers, and so on either had to go or be brought up to present-day safety standards. Service was scheduled to resume in June of 1984, or so the contract read. No one knew exactly what troubles lay ahead. There were 100-year-old sewer pipes, rusted-out water mains, plus a track layout that was almost in shreds. 11 separate utility companies, including telephone, electricity, gas, cable TV, sewers, and water, had to be scheduled and the work done. These matters, while consuming months and months of time, would have been considered routine, except that winter was the wettest in 100 years. Excuse me, my allergies. Despite delay after delay for weather, 69 city blocks were torn up and put back down to make a proper roadbed. The Washington Mason car barn was rebuilt from the roof down inside, preserved outside, and earthquake retrofitted, including the old chimney that formerly exhausted the smoke from the coal fires under the boilers in the days of steam power. San Francisco believes in preserving faded glories strongly. The Committee to Save the Cable Cars managed to promote $10 million, and federal funding of $53.5 million paid the rest of the bills. Besides all this work, the cars themselves had to be rebuilt from the track up and refurbished in 100 different ways. Had the work not been properly scheduled, chaos could have resulted, and instead of 20 months, rebuilding could have gone on for 20 years. 11 California cars and 26 Powell cars were repainted and generally spiffed up. Also, the cars were rewired for 12-volt battery-powered headlamps. Though such headlights have advanced from oil lamps of yesterday, the battery-powered versions give off about as much illumination as a milk bottle full of fireflies. 2 new cars for the Powell line were built from the track up in the Muni's own shops using drawings first produced in the late 1800s. From their ornate roofs to their shiny brass bells and slat benches, each car turned out to be a thing of beauty and a joy for at least 60 years, barring a sudden plunge down the Hyde Street hill. When cars need repairs or just a sprucing up, the work is done in the Muni's own shops. Parts are milled by hand rather than shopping around for some distant supplier to fill an order, even if any could still be found. Wooden frames are hand-tooled by local carpenters using patterns that are so old and faded they're almost falling apart. A new car can be made from the wheels up in about a year and costs $30,000. Compared with the price of current automobiles or a new bus, hand-fashioning a new cable car is a bargain. The average quality automobile today sells for $35,000 and carries no more than 5 passengers, while a cable car can pack in as many as 90. I didn't realize that many. Besides, since many of the cars have been in service for almost 100 years, new cars can be counted on to last a long, long time. A new bus is stretching its life if it goes past 20. Muni maintains a staff of about 300 men and women to keep the cable cars in working order. As August 1973 approached, the urge to reenact the original descent of the Clay Street Hill proved irresistible. Politicians, always eager to show their interest in good causes, wanted to stage an anniversary party. Remember the cable cars, or something like that. And so it was that a recreation of the original day and time was planned by whomever makes such plans. The date was 100 years to the day after the maiden voyage of the first cable car in 1873. The Cable Car Museum produced Old 8, the only surviving member of the original fleet of 1873. Since these cars were born in San Francisco, Old Number 8 has to be the oldest cable car in the world. Not an unforgettable fact. There was also a second unforgettable fact. There were no longer tracks on Clay Street. Nothing daunted, the committee mounted Old Number 8 on a huge flatbed truck and trundled it over to the corner of Clay and Jones for the ceremonies. A local rail historian, Fred Stint, dressed in top hat and flowing whiskers, impersonated Andrew Holiday and grabbed hold of the grip for the benefit of the photographers. Also on hand was a bagpipe. Can't say that. Also on hand was a bagpipe band. Huntley Bim Soyster dressed as Emperor Norton, Mrs. Soyster as Lily Hitchcock Coit, after whom the tower on Telegraph Hill is named, and Charlotte Maillard Swig, costumed as Lotta Crabtree, plus W.C. Fields. What W.C. Fields had to do with either the original cable car or the city of San Francisco, for that matter, was a mystery to all who stood by in the wind and foggy darkness waiting for something to happen. Then, as if by magic carpet, Mayor Joseph Alioto limousined into view. Half an hour late. He presented his usual dapper self. Once the mayor and the reenactors were in their places, the truck driver fired up the engine and dragged the party down to Portsmouth Square, where the speechifying began. Participants delivered large globs of sentiment and nostalgia, plus a liberal dose of memories manufactured for the occasion. As the entourage passed through Chinatown, the mayor was waving and grinning at one and all. Suddenly, he realized he ought to do something besides smile and wave, since all those Oriental faces belonged to voters. He grabbed an aide's arm and asked, "How do you say good morning in Chinese?" No one knew. So smiles begot further smiles. Half-hearted cheers invited hand waves. A bystander on the float remarked, "Maybe Signor Alioto should ask Signor Marco Polo." Seriously, people had different senses of humor. Different generations, I gotta say. All right. We're moving on up. Yeah, a few more pages to go, everybody. Rail historians are dedicated people, Ulysses. Hello, Irma in the Philippines. All right, I'm going to keep going with this. What happened with the speeches? Once the speeches began, Mrs. Friedel Klusman, she of stout heart and fixed opinions, became the heroine of the hour. The mayor, in a burst of effervescent ebullience, spoke of Mrs. Klusman as the Queen, the Joan of Arc, the grandmother of the cable cars. He didn't mention that the system was currently losing $2.5 million a year, nor did he say he felt more like an icicle than a renowned public official. When the dignitaries finally ran out of breath and boredom had reduced the stamina as well as the number of bystanders, the crowd adjourned to Victorian Park, a plaza on the other side of town at the foot of Hyde Street overlooking Aquatic Park and the bay and hard by Fisherman's Wharf. Here, the initial run of one of the brand new cars, constructed in the Muni's own shops, especially for the occasion, was ready to hit the streets of San Francisco in a blaze of public pride and jingoistic hoopla. I love my grandfather's writing. And again, everyone had said about all there was to say, and the spanking new car headed a parade of 14 cars back up Hyde Street, a trip that nearly ended in calamity. Dun, dun, dun. Boosters like to point to the tremendous adaptability of the cars. But this time, so many people piled on board the new car, the Gripman couldn't get it rolling. At length, the crowd of somewhere between 100 and 150 thinned out, and the parade of 14 cars clattered up the Hyde Street Hill on its way downtown, much to the annoyance of the usual riders who had to take buses. Over the years, the cable cars have carved a niche in the hearts of most San Franciscans. One family used to keep hot apple pie and fresh milk on their kitchen steps at Washington and Gough Streets. Even when the house was torn down and a multi-storied apartment building rose in its place, the residents still managed to keep the custom alive for years. In less frantic times, cable car riders who rode the cables regularly used to ask the gripman to please stop in front of a given house, while the other passengers smiled indulgently and didn't complain that the brief pause was an imposition on their time. But then cable car crews are responsible for much of the good feelings surrounding the three lines. On each of the 27 cars in operation at any given time are a gripman and a conductor. The conductor mans the rear brake crank and collects the fares. The gripman is there to grab the cable with the 280-pound device specially engineered for the job of grabbing a cable and not letting go until the next stop. How the municipal railway management picks these men is one of those arcane rituals best left to supposition, since any variance might undo the happy balance of expertise, physical strength, and joyful attitude that appears either to be learned or born in cable car personnel. Joking and kidding around is part of being a cable conductor or gripman, and the Muni and the riding public is fortunate to have crews who can go with the flow or fade with the punches, no matter what the provocation. A relaxed attitude plus a readiness to meet the unexpected with equanimity is probably one of the most useful assets a cable car conductor or gripman can master. Also, a sense of humor is mandatory. On a particularly busy afternoon during summer vacation, as a jam-packed car was about to descend from Nob Hill into the depth of Lower Powell, a woman passenger asked a gripman, "How long have you been on this job?" The gripman answered, "Started yesterday." There are not a whole lot of rules and regulations about riding a cable car, but those that exist are simple exercises in common sense, and the two men on board the cars are responsible for their enforcement. No reading while standing on the outer running boards. Passing vehicles can brush a reader engrossed in a book or a magazine into the street. Also, there are those riders who favor the iffy trade of the movie stuntman and try to leave the car by jumping into the street, forgetting that they are moving at 9.5 miles an hour, about half the speed a sprinter can run. The look ma, no hands move has produced many a bloody nose and sometimes broken bones. If a passenger doesn't like the rules, he's welcome to try a face full of stitches. Recently, a conductor, busily collecting fares as his car approached a sharp turn from Powell into Jackson, looked up just in time to remind his passengers to look out for the coive. He lost his footing as the car rounded the bend and fell into the street, coins from his collection spurting into the gutters, much to the delight of some small boys on their way home from school. Another rule that developed from experience was outlawing of being a young boy in San Francisco. What? Was outlawing of being a young boy in San Francisco involved the custom of strapping on your roller skates, coasting over to a spot where a cable line crossed a flat intersection, hooking onto the rear end of a car as it paused to take on or let off passengers, and getting pulled up to the top of the hill, from which vantage point everyone would shush back down the hill while tourists watched and mothers retched. Once the women's movement got into high gear, applicants for positions on the cable crews began streaming into the personnel office. A few women who appeared strong enough to muscle up on the grip and then the brakes, in other words, to start and stop the cars, got tryouts. After 4 or 5 intersections where the cars rumble to a stop and then on signal latch again onto the cable, the chosen women were exhausted. Letting go the cable, applying the brakes, then hauling back on the grip to grab the cable for a further ascent proved an exercise in stamina and strength that the women were not ready to explore further. Despite a generous paycheck at week's end, the lifting of the equivalent of 125 pounds every time the gripman hauls the lever all the way back proved more than the women could stand. If traffic on the streets is thick, repetition of the exercise is almost continuous, as often as 10 or 20 times in one block. Most cable men can take such a beating, but only the most fit and hardy last more than a couple of weeks. Wow. Some women thought the conductor's job, manning the rear brakes and collecting fares, might prove less fatiguing, but after plowing through passengers encrusted on the running boards, jostling with the noisy throng inside the packed seating area, then being asked to stumble through to the back platform and wind the brake crank with a heavy load of passengers on board, again proved more than women were willing to endure. Cheerleaders proved more than women were willing to endure. Cheerleaders from the National Organization for Women notwithstanding. There are few, if any, cities that have anointed a public transportation system with song and glory. Glenn Hurlbert's Cable Car Concerto is a case in point. San Francisco's durable recorder of civic ephemera, Herb Caen, once wrote a children's book, The Cable Car and the Dragon. Of course, Tony Bennett, who comes back about every 3 weeks to find his lost heart, has sung about cable cars so many times his listeners try to make themselves disappear into their chairs every time the band plays the introductory bars. Not only do song and story celebrate cable cars, Neiman Marcus, the Emporium, and Macy's often feature cable car designs on dresses, jackets, and sweaters. From time to time, bookstores feature histories that attempt to explain the cable car's unique mechanical complexities. Once a local hat designer fashioned a cable car hat for one of Hollywood's celebrity models. A wag suggested he should have included a grip, as any hat that big without suitable restraint would blow away in one of summer's late afternoon typhoons off the Pacific. Some years back, right after World War II, a local real estate developer bought a small number of cable cars to form a fleet of gasoline-powered jitneys, and now rents them out to companies and conventioneers for trips around town and between hotels. Since many tourists think these tally-ho coaches are the real thing, they try to get on board for a trip to Fisherman's Wharf, only to find the driver is working between the St. Francis and Palace hotels. The Muni has also sold about 30 cars to buyers who have converted them into snack bars, swimming pool dressing rooms, duck blinds, greenhouses, and gazebos. Visitors should not fear that cable car runaways are a regular occurrence. Far from it, but they do happen. Back in the 40s, a California streetcar slipped its grip and thundered down California Street from Grant Avenue to Kearny, where the track flattens out for its run to the ferry building. The terrified gripman did what he could as the car gathered speed. Some passengers jumped to the street, while others clung desperately to whatever was handy. As the car careened into the crossing at Kearny Street, a wholesale butcher's wagon sat squarely on the tracks. Amidst the sounds of shattering glass, screams, and splitting wood, the two vehicles collided. The unhurt passengers crawled from the wreckage, horrified to find themselves surrounded by animal parts. They were on the street. Around them were livers, brains, bladders, the offal of the butcher's trade. Fortunately, besides cuts and bruises, none of the passengers suffered more than severe shock. Tourists and locals alike have grown so used to getting someplace with a minimum of bother, they rarely think of cable cars as unsafe, having heard somewhere that there's a much greater chance of being struck by lightning than being hurt on a cable car. Yet the cars do have their share of accidents. Muni has gone above and beyond the call of screechers to do everything humanly possible to make the system safe. The rewards for such effort have proved satisfactory, but as on any contrivance operated and controlled by human beings, there are exceptions. When faced with the possibility of mayhem in the streets, the sachems at City Hall invariably point to any injury as a freak accident. The more people injured, the more freakish the incident becomes. Talking with the gripmen and conductors, however, provides some reassurance for most worriers. Brakes seem to be the number one worry. A gripman reports, "The cars are able to stop whether the tracks are wet or dry. These cars have been running for well over 100 years now, and even if it snows a bit, I can still stop okay. You just have to be a lot more careful." On the typical Powell car, the gripman controls 4 mechanical brake shoes, one on each wheel, with a foot pedal. This is a braking system similar to that on cars and trucks built before the days of 4-wheel hydraulic brakes. On the rear of the Powell cars, there's a long brass crank with which the conductor can activate 4 more brake shoes on the steep grades from the crest of Nob Hill down to Sutter, for instance. A second set of brakes consists of 4 heavy wood blocks located between the wheels. The gripman, by stepping on the pedal, can force the wood down onto the rails. The track brakes lift the car slightly off the track. Together with an application of sand, these blocks provide added stopping power under loaded conditions. Wooden brakes last about 4 days with normal conditions. In wet weather, however, they wear out in 2 days. If the need to brake hard and fast arises, the real stopper is the emergency slot brake. A piece of heavy steel that jams into the slot between the grip guides and can stop a car with a jolt, sometimes so solidly repair crews have to use a welding torch to cut it loose. Recently, to make sure the slot brakes would work in an emergency, Muni blocked off a street and loaded a car with 4 tons of sandbags. The cable was disengaged and the car allowed to run down a steep hill at 35 miles an hour. When the emergency brake dropped into the slot, the car stopped dead on the rails. Any passenger on board would have been thrown into the street. At one point, air brakes were tested, but the old-fashioned brakes performed every bit as well as those designed by George Westinghouse. One of the more bizarre accidents on the cable cars happened in 1964 in a crash on the Hyde Line. A 29-year-old blonde typewriter instructor from Michigan suffered cuts and bruises. She asserted the psychic effects of the accident transformed her from a sedate damsel into a raving nymphomaniac. She testified in court the crash and its emotional vibrations had caused her to lie with 62 men. An architect from Palo Alto and a San Francisco restaurateur argued that the girl exaggerated. As the trial progressed, psychiatrists testified that the rude jolt had awakened long-forgotten memories of child abuse by her father. As compensation, she asked the city for $500,000. The jury told her she would have to calm her shattered self with $50,000, which, to a certain extent, proves that some people can have their cake and eat it too. The Hyde Street hill that descends to the waterfront near the Maritime Museum is the steepest of all the hills the cars have to navigate, and not surprisingly has been the site of the most serious accidents. In 1967, 2 people died and 43 suffered serious injuries when a car rammed several automobiles at the Bay Street crossing. The grip on the cable failed. Neither the wheel nor the track brakes were strong enough to arrest the car loaded with 90 passengers. Before the gripman could lower the emergency brake into the slot, the packed car picked up speed and plummeted into the traffic crossing at Hyde at Bay Street. Again in 1984, 23 passengers watched in agony as a wild automobile driver, apparently intent on killing himself, rammed a cable car as it labored up the same hill. His suicide was successful, but the gripman, badly shaken and bloodied, managed to set the brakes and keep the car from diving back down the slope out of control. In 1971, a defective wire in the Powell cable broke loose and entangled itself in the grip, so the gripman couldn't release the car from the cable. Clanging his bell frantically, the gripman tried to warn the traffic ahead of his car as the snarled wires dragged the car forward at a steady 9.5 miles per hour. Nothing worked. As though under the control of the sorcerer's apprentice, the cable car towed itself down Powell Street, where it smashed into 3 others parked at the Powell turntable. Today, there are sensors all along the route of both the Powell and California lines. A loose wire in the cable strikes a sensor that immediately sounds an alarm at the powerhouse. There, guards stop the electric motors that drive the cable. Everything comes to a grinding halt, much to the dismay of passengers who have journeyed from faraway places for the express purpose of riding a cable car. Once the cars come to a stop, the cable is slowly wound back through the powerhouse until the broken wire is located. Sometimes the repair is simple and the cars start up again. Sometimes the patching crew halts the entire system and splices a new piece into place. 100 feet or so of cable must be secured and shaped. There can be no variation in the diameter of the main cable, or it will not pass through the pulleys and other operating paraphernalia under the street. General repairs, such as changing the cable every 100 days, making splices, and so on, takes place during the late evening or early morning hours when the cars are out of service. It's a quirk of personality, possibly, but the locals get pretty huffy about the noise cable cars make as they trundle along the tracks. First, there is the endless hum of the cable itself as it slithers along in its vault under the street. The steel pulleys and other contrivances that guide the endless rope of hemp and steel in its journey around the curves and keeps it from jumping out of the slot produce a high-pitched, jingling sound. To remedy this, engineers, after yet another expensive study, replaced the steel pulleys with some made of nylon. Also, there is the problem of the steel plates, about 2,000 of them, that cover the holes provided for the track walkers who grease the mechanism and its multiple pulleys. Since none of these steel covers fit tight, passing automobiles create a clang-clang when the metal lids slap the metal boxes. A restaurateur, whose patrons complained the noise in front of his establishment was ruining their dinners, stuffed a rag under the offending plate to muffle the harshness. Where tracks start uphill, there are depression beams to hold the cable so it won't jump out of its slot. They make a lot of noise. Not so long ago, a couple who lived at the crest of the Hyde Street Hill became so exercised about the discords of the cable in front of their house, they went to court to make the city comply with its own noise ordinances. The court ruled the city was not subject to its own laws controlling civic hubbub. Another resident of the same neighborhood with a degree in electrical engineering and revenge burning in his heart threatened to record the sound, amplify it to the level of a rock band, and play it day and night in front of the mayor's house. That's funny. In the very early days when the cars were new on the streets, the residents along the Divisadero line were jolted into laughter when the moving cable suddenly hopped out of its proper slot and stretched itself free as a clothesline from one hilltop to the next, 150 feet in the air. Some years back, as the California cable paused at Grant Avenue in the heart of Chinatown to disembark passengers, an elderly Chinese, seeing the car at rest, shouted to the conductor, "What's the matter? String broke?" In 1984, Linda Bird Johnson, daughter of the President of the United States, was visiting San Francisco with her husband, Senator Charles Robb of Virginia. They had just bought a fine double-decker butterscotch ice cream at Swenson's original store, See Us Freeze, at the corner of Union and Hyde Streets on the advice of Cyril Magnan, lenient shepherd of notables. As the Robbs tried to reboard a crowded car when it stopped to unload, the gripman told Mrs. Robb she would have to get rid of the cone or forget riding downtown on the cable. While Mr. Magnan tried to explain who these VIPs were, Linda Bird solved the problem by dropping into the street. As she was quoted in the Wall Street Journal, "I didn't want to throw away such a good ice cream cone, so I felt it best to wait for the next car." Herb Caen at the time, the San Francisco Chronicle's Mr. Pepys relates the tale of the gripman, who one hot afternoon found himself with only one passenger aboard. As he passed Swenson's Ice Cream Emporium on Russian Hill, he stopped the car, got off, bought 2 ice cream cones, climbed back aboard, and presented one of them to the woman rider. Gripmen can also be a little less than gallant. One day, a passenger's hat blew off and bounded down the hill. The conductor rang the bell for a halt and then turned to the unlucky rider and said, "You've got to chase it yourself, friend. Right now, I'm too tired to be quaint and too lazy to be colorful." Perhaps one of the jollier celebrations in San Francisco is the annual Municipal Cable Car Bell Ringing Championship, held in the spring of each year somewhere around Union Square. While not a long, drawn-out extravaganza, the contest does afford amusement for any number of noonday bag lunchers in the square and tourists on their way to somewhere else. San Franciscans are accustomed to the observance, but the rite fascinates foreigners. Generally, the bell from a gasoline-powered cable car is used for the ceremony. Occasionally, however, a bell bolted to a 2x10 plank suffices. While the rumble of the working cable cars on Powell Street line provides an obligato, the bell ringers do their thing with gusto and accomplishment. To the winner, a prize of $1,000. Second prize is a $500 certificate for men's clothing, while third place fetches $250. The complexity of the contest is awesome. Auditioning judges have only the rhythms on which to base an opinion. From the nature of the instrument, there is only one note and one key. Some conductors become so proficient with the warning bell, though, they can actually play one-note tunes. During the Easter shopping season, when the streets fill up with customers, there used to be a gripman who proceeded up Powell Street, clanging his gong in the time signature of Irving Berlin's Easter Parade. "In your Easter bonnet, ding, ding." A listener had to have a bit of imagination, but it was surprising how many pedestrians got the message. As one winner back in 1977 explained, "I practice all the time. I keep a tune in my head while I'm working on the line, and when I have to use the gong, I just put what's in my head into my wrist and make the gong do what's right." He also admitted that having been a jazz drummer for 20 years was certainly an aid to shake, rattle, and roll cable car style. Usually there are as many as 30 gripmen who compete, doing a 2-minute percussive number on the gong. Asked if he enjoyed driving a cable car, one prize winner said he felt much better driving his 1952 Bentley Saloon. There is little doubt the mechanical aspects of San Francisco's cable railway tend to glaze the vision and numb the hearing. But a half hour or so in the Cable Car Museum and a powerhouse at the corner of Mason and Washington Streets can be a lesson in the hypnotic power of massive machinery, as well as a short course in practical physics. The sound is relentless. The air is heavy with the smell of grease and warmed by the endless friction of moving parts moving. 3 sets of huge wheels, called sheaves and pronounced shivs, right, I get that wrong, shivs, 10 feet in diameter, whirl at a steady 78 revolutions per minute. A 510 horsepower electric motor drives each cable. The cables for the 2 Powell Street lines and the California Street line enter the building through a tunnel from under the street outside, slip into the grooves of the driving shiv, wind around the first wheel, do a figure 8 around the second wheel, which is turning in a reverse direction, passes along the tension wheel that takes up the slack caused by the inevitable stretching of the steel strands and the cable, and disappears under the street again. This system of motive power for the car lines has existed since 1877 when it was introduced by the Sutter Street Line. The term winding room dates from the beginnings of cabledom. The cables wind around the driving wheels much in the manner of a fishing reel, only instead of staying put on the reel, cables wind up and then unwind in an endless process that lasts for about 100 days when the cable has to be replaced. The shiny stuff on the cable is pine tar, a lubricant that helps the grip and yet prevents excessive wear. Tourists love the cables. For some obscure reason, they yearn to shake hands with a very live Victorian past. They can't wait to rattle across town past all those skinny old houses on 25-foot lots set cheek by jowl along Outer Mason Street. Each summer they stand in block-long lines at the Powell and Market turntable, dressed in flimsy shorts and sports shirts appropriate only to St. Louis in August. As they wait in the freezing wind of a San Francisco summer, they yearn for the moment when they can say with no small measure of bravado, "Why, yes, we rode the cable car all the way to Fisherman's Wharf and back." Even on sunny days, which in July and August are rare, the breezes off the Pacific can create goosebumps. Once upon a time, riders could generate some measure of warmth by lending a shoulder to the cable crew and help reverse the cars at the turntable. But that was before lawsuits for personal injury assumed the status of an indoor sport. The quaint old-fashioned turntable contraption dates from before the turn of the century. It has been there so long the natives don't even notice it anymore, for the cable car is both the start and the end of any trip across town. One of the sights of the city is to watch the gripman and the conductor jump off a car once it has come to a full stop on the turntable and begin shoving and pushing to reverse the car and point its nose toward the top of Nob Hill. The turntable's mechanism has been replaced, updated, revised, and renewed, but the work of swinging it into place is still too manpower. Once shoved into position on its return tracks, the car begins the ascent across ever-steepening grades to the crest of Nob Hill, past the Stanford Court, the Fairmont, and the University Club. The tracks then plunge on down Powell to end a couple of blocks from Fisherman's Wharf. There, passengers dismount to enable yet another crew to perform yet another turntable dervish. While the California line gets its share of tourist trade, riders tend to be much less enthusiastic. They board where California meets Drum Street at Market. Halfway up Nob Hill, they usually stop off in Chinatown. Next stop, the top of Nob Hill to gawk at the Bay Bridge, then perhaps into the watering holes at the Mark Hopkins, Stanford Court, or Fairmont hotels where it's warm and cozy. People who advocate hill-climbing buses or want to travel faster than 9.5 miles an hour to get nowhere in particular are invited to visit Los Angeles, every San Franciscan's favorite object of small affection. So, aside from all that, barring another 1906 catastrophe, the cable cars will keep rocking and rolling through the streets, their bells a-twitter and their metallic groans echoing off the glass storefronts until jet skis and skateboards are considered old-fashioned. Tourists are the city's chief source of revenue. The cable car is the chief civic centerpiece. After all, a tourist, in the minds of the sachems at City Hall, is a load of gold on a donkey's back. And that, as everyone knows, opens many a door. And that is the end of the cable car capers. We've learned a lot about cable cars today in San Francisco. There are many accidents, but also how safe they are. I have ridden the cable cars in San Francisco many a time, and I love them. Perfect timing. I don't know what's going on here, everybody. My camera's broken, but that's okay. I will read again tomorrow, everyone. I hope you're all well. Thank you for joining me. Oh, I'm back. There we go. I'm back. Um, Is that working still? Go. Audio. Ho, ho. Okay. Woohoo! That was quite a little, poo-poo, crash down. Crash, 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 computer crash. Let's hope it doesn't crash so much for This Week in Science tonight, right? I need to go finish my show planning for This Week in Science. Thank you for joining me for another reading from my grandfather's book, Nowhere Except San Francisco, Memoirs of a Resident Tourist by Tro Harper. I will read again tomorrow. We have Gold in Them Thar Hills and The Hero of Fisherman's Wharf. Lots of fun. And I'll leave you with this picture. It was good timing. It worked perfectly. Cable cars. Cable car capers. All right. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of wherever you are. 3 p.m. tomorrow, I'll be back for more reading. Bye. Thanks for joining me.